Good evening. Well, good evening, and welcome to another Wednesday night Bible study. My name is Rob Wood. I'm the pastor at Wanda United Methodist Church, and thrilled to have you back with us again tonight. So, this evening we're going to finish up chapter 13 out of 1 Corinthians. When we started this quite some time ago, we were mainly looking at just kind of going through what's known as the love verse. And as we did it, of course, we got hit with all this coronavirus stuff. And so we just continued on through chapter 13. And tonight we're actually going to go ahead and finish it up. Last week, we made it all the way through verse 11, up to verse 11. And I'm going to go ahead and read that now. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So part of what Paul is saying here is he's talking about that idea of seeing a poor reflection of himself in a mirror. You have to remember, in Paul's time, it was largely mirrors would have been polished metal. So it wouldn't have been like looking in your bathroom mirror in the morning and really, unfortunately, seeing a very good representation of who we are. It would have been kind of blurry. It would have never been really fully formed. One of the things that he's saying is when we move on, when we are actually with Christ, we will see not that fuzzy reflection, but we will see with clarity. We will see Christ in all his glory. As we look at that, we think about, as we see Christ face to face, we will know him as well as he knows us, because he fully knows us. I mean, he honestly knows us better than we know ourselves. In a lot of ways, that's exactly what having that relationship with Christ is knowing and acknowledging that, hey, Christ knows me better than I know myself. And a lot of the things that are going to happen to me are ultimately for my best. I understand that's not always easy to see. That's often very difficult to see. But we have to kind of look at that bigger picture and understand that all the things that happen to us in this life are not about just this life. There's so much more beyond, as Paul says, this mortal coil. And when we really get into it and think about when we are with Christ, a lot of the questions that we have now, a lot of the things that we look at and say, God, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this to me now? We'll actually have an opportunity to see and understand how those things worked and why we went through so many of them. So I really, as I was going through this and looking at the ideas of love and looking at all the things that I know that I've struggled with, we've all had tragedy in our lives. Obviously, right now we're going through a very difficult time with all this COVID-19 coronavirus, and even before that, a lot of the political turmoil and so many things that we've had going on. Understanding that we are still, even in the midst of natural disasters, even in the midst of pandemics, even in the midst of political turmoil, we are still called, above all else, to love one another. Plainly and simply, we are called to love, to take and kind of separate ourselves away from things and acknowledge that even though we may not always like where things are going, what things are happening, that we are still called to love our fellow man. We are still called to love even our enemies. We are so called to accept the things that happen, do our best to make this world a better place, but understanding that ultimately we're gearing ourselves for what happens next. We are gearing and preparing ourselves for eternity. It's not just about what may happen to me, if I'm blessed to live into my 80s or 90s, which I don't really expect, but to say, whatever time I have, to be thankful for it and to acknowledge and to understand that it is building onto what will come when I have the opportunity to be with Christ and to see him fully as he sees me now. One of my absolute favorite verses is actually what comes next, what closes out chapter 13. Paul says, "And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love." That's not to diminish how important faith and hope can be, especially it's so important, especially now, to have faith and hope. But it's even more important to have love, to love those who we may not agree with, to love those who may not believe the same way we do, to love those who we have a real problem with. We're still called to love. And as we think about that love, it becomes kind of difficult sometimes, because you can kind of get in your head and think, well, if I'm supposed to love, that means I just have to accept everything that anybody does. Not necessarily. Paul tells us we are to rebuke. If someone's doing something wrong, it's okay to point it out. I believe it's okay to point it out in an educational way, to say, maybe they don't realize that Scripture says something. It doesn't do us any good. As a matter of fact, it's counterproductive in my mind to walk up to somebody and get in their face and say, "Oh, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're gonna go to hell. You're gonna rot in hell because of what you're doing." I don't know anybody, anywhere, anytime that argument won anybody. I know odds are as a matter of fact, not that odds are, I've seen me do this. When someone comes up and tells me that I'm wrong and gets in my face and tries to belittle me in some way, I go exactly the opposite direction. I'll tend to go say, "Oh yeah, well, hey, hide and watch this." But when we actually go to someone and we talk to them with a heart filled with love, with an attitude of worship, to say, I want to make sure you understand what Scripture says. And you know what? If you may sin differently than I do, because guess what? I do. I know that. There's no, I'm not going to ever be one of those pastors that steps back and says, oh, look at me. You should just emulate and be like me. No, because I'm not that guy. And quite honestly, I don't know any pastors who really are. We all have our faults. We all fall short. And oftentimes I'm a little leery of anybody who says they don't fall short. But what I do know is that what saves me, what grounds me, what gives me faith and hope and love is that understanding that it is all about my relationship with Christ. My relationship with Christ is about my salvation. I will do anything I can to help anybody else develop that relationship with Christ. But ultimately, it comes down to your relationship with Christ is about your salvation and about the grace that is offered to you. To take that understanding with us wherever we go. To know that, we can look at somebody and say, boy, what they're doing right now, that's against what Scripture says. May well be. But we've also got to watch out for that plank in our own eye when we go to point out the splinter in someone else's. To understand that it's good to have conversations. It's good to talk to each other with love and respect. And to be able to say, hey, you know what? This is maybe where we need to be. I want to help be there for you with the expectation that maybe you're going to help be there with me. Because sometimes our faith gets shaken. Sometimes we have trouble finding hope. But one of the things that we are constantly, continuously, emphatically called to do, that is love each other. Love each other as Christ loved us. To love each other as we love ourselves. And I know for anybody who's watched me over these last several weeks as we've been doing this, I talk a lot about that idea of being able to love ourselves. And it is so important. It is so important to acknowledge that we have to love us. Because we're called to love others as we love us. We have to love us. It's a command. It's one of those command things that Christ gives us. So we have to learn to accept our faults with understanding, with faith, with hope for the future. And we have to build that love to move forward so that we can really reach out and not reach out to other people in a judgmental type way. It's not about being judgmental at somebody else. It's not about, I am not called upon by God to sit in judgment. And I am so thankful that that is not what being a Christian is about. It is not my job to sit in judgment of anybody else. It's my job to make sure that I'm right with Christ and to encourage others, to help others, and above all, to love others. If my actions in love can help really share Christ's love with someone else, then I'm doing my job. Not as a pastor, as a Christian, as a man who follows God. That's what I'm called to do. That's what we're all called to do. Not to sit in judgment over somebody else. Not to point a finger at somebody. Not to say, you're doing wrong. Because we don't win any arguments that way. We can sit down, we can have a conversation, and we can do it with love and respect, without anger, without animosity. And we can build on those ideas. And we can help others find and build their relationship with Christ. I don't define your relationship with Christ. You do. You and Christ define that relationship. And you know what? Where my relationship is today versus where it was 10 years ago, very different place. That's one of the beautiful things about our faith is we have these opportunities to grow. John Wesley was so big into the idea of literally having intentional spiritual development. Don't get caught in that trap of saying, oh, well, I go to church, so I'm saved, so I'm good. That's not what it's about. It's about developing that relationship with Jesus Christ. It is about strengthening those bonds of love with each other. It is about building on those things. It is about worshiping in that way. It's about literally understanding that the greatest thing I can do is be there for someone else. To hold their hand, to lift them up. When all this coronavirus stuff is over, even to just give a hug. To know that my job is to love you. My job is to help make sure you see the beauty in you. While also acknowledging that there is some in myself as well. And that is not always easy. As a matter of fact, that is not ever easy. But it is part of what we're called to do. So I encourage you very much to go back through and read chapter 13. To spend some time in Corinthians. Really think about these love verses. And think about, how do you express love? Not just for your family, not just for your friends, but even sometimes for those you're not so fond of. Even, dare I say it, your enemies. Because that's what we're called to do. Thank you for joining me. Next week we'll do it again. I'm not sure exactly what we're going to dive into, but we will dive into something. And I hope you enjoy that as much as I've enjoyed this. Be blessed And for the folks at Wanda, I will see you at our drive-in church service Sunday morning at 10 a.m. And if anybody else is looking to come on down to Wanda United Methodist Church and pull in and tune your radio to 92.1 FM and just have a good time. Be blessed. Thank you.